Hello, my name is Tyler McCann, and I'm the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Before we begin our discussion today, I want to acknowledge that I'm participating in this webinar from Bristol, Quebec, located on the traditional unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. As an organization, CAPI recognizes that there are many steps on the road to reconciliation, and that it is a journey we must continue to all take together. Canadian agriculture and food face big challenges with the potential for very different solutions that lead to very different outcomes for the sector. Dialogue and debate are essential to getting better policy outcomes. Instead of shying away from thoughtful debate, we think we should embrace it. To advance CAPI's mission of advancing policy solutions, the Ag Policy Exchange webinar series offers a platform for respectful dialogue to explore different perspectives on critical policy issues. If you require simultaneous language interpretation, please click on the Wordly link in the chat and select the language of your choice. This Ag Policy Exchange asks the question, what does Budget 2025 mean for Canadian agriculture and agri-food? All of CAPI's work is made possible thanks to the support of partners who know that agriculture and agri-food can do more and that policy plays a critical role in unlocking the sector's potential. Today's webinar was funded by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada under the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnerships Agri-Competitiveness Program. We are also pleased that this webinar is part of our ongoing partnership with RealAgriculture. Working together, we're excited to bring more of those conversations to people working on farms and industry, civil society, and government across multiple platforms to contribute to a more competitive, sustainable, and resilient agri-food sector in Canada. To learn more about the work that we and RealAgriculture do, please visit realagriculture.com or CAPI's website. Today, Shaun will moderate our panel discussion. Our three panelists are Scott Ross from the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, Christina Farrell from Food and Beverage Canada, and I will slide into a panelist chair. But before I do that, we'd like to hear from you. There's a poll on the screen where we'd like to hear your thoughts. We'd like to know what your reaction to the budget is today. That poll question had popped up, but seems to have popped away again. We'll just try that one more time. So what we want to do is to hear from you around what do you think Budget 2025 means for Canadian agriculture and agri-food? Is it positive with investments to make the sector stronger, neutral with some good and some bad, negative cuts that will hurt the sector, or unsure? And it depends on how it's all implemented. So we'd like to you to take the time to tell us what you think, and that will set up the discussion that we're going to have after. The budget was a big budget, a complex budget. There was new investments. There was a mix of new investments with old money. And then there were these strategic cuts and expenditure review where there was a limited amount of information that was made available, but does look like it's on track to reduce spending inside the Agriculture Department by about 15%, depending on how we do the math. So please take your time to tell us what you think. And then throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A function to ask some questions and take the time to prompt a debate and dialogue with the panelists. And so, Shaun, we will see what people say here, and then I will hand it over to you. So 41% of our participants think that the budget was neutral, and it's about tied with those that think it's either positive or negative. But the second largest group think that they are unsure, and it depends on how it is all implemented. So, Shaun, with that, welcome to the webinar, and I'll hand it over to you.
Hey, thanks a lot, Tyler. Really do appreciate it. And thanks everybody for tuning in here today for this webinar on a very, very important issue. So let's see what the panelists have to say about this question. And I'm going to start with Scott Ross from the CFA. Scott, quickly, how does Budget 2025, what does Budget 2025 mean for agriculture and the sector?
Well, I think it's great to see some language recognizing agriculture as a strategic economic driver for the country, which I think is something we've all been articulating for some time. But I think at the end of the day, if you're asking for a 30-second kind of soundbite here, it's that regardless of how we are portrayed as a strategic sector or recognized, I think this budget makes clear that we're competing with every other sector in the Canadian economy for attention, and we need to find a way to make the opportunity and challenges of our sector kind of resonate. And to me, that centers around clarity of priorities and working together with one strong voice as a sector, which is something I think historically we have always struggled to really accomplish in agriculture. And I think there's a lot in the budget in that whole. I think you look at the unsure kind of category, and I think there's a lot that could be beneficial to agriculture, but it's incumbent upon us and government to find a way to see agriculture actually benefit from those investments.
Yeah, I think the unsure is, I think that's how I would have voted in terms of like, I think it kind of depends. And we might not be able to accurately say the impact until we get a little bit further down the road here in the coming months. So Scott, we're going to get back to you in a little bit here. Up next, Christina Farrell, who is the CEO of Food and Beverage Canada. Christina, it's great to chat with you.
Thank you for having me. Well, it's great that it recognizes Agri-Food's role. That's certainly not always the case. It hasn't been the case every year. And it adds some helpful pieces on tax incentives. We saw some new fun language in there on a productivity super deduction and some of the trade enabling stuff, which is good news as well. But that said, there is one major gap, at least for the food and beverage manufacturing side. We didn't see that domestic processing fund, which was something that the Liberals committed to in their election platform. And really, at the end of the day, we need multi-year capital support to modernize our plants if we're looking to capture more value here in Canada.
Oh, interesting. Good point there. Good way to piece that out. Okay, we're going to get back to you in a second. Tyler, it's your turn. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I probably am also someone that's in the unsure, but I think that's largely because we don't know what the cuts are going to be. We know the amounts, but really how they do those cuts will influence a lot of what's underneath it. But I think that agriculture, what this has exposed is that the Prime Minister and his government have tried to pivot the budget to be about investing more, spending less. But I think if you look at how the government responded to stakeholder priorities in the budget, they continue to spend less and not invest more. And I think it speaks to how does agriculture pivot, how it thinks about what it wants the government to do to better align with this new direction that the new federal government is trying to take it.
Okay, we're going to bring all of our panelists all together here at the back end of the webinar, but I'm going to bring Scott Ross from the Canadian Federation of Agriculture back, really putting our producer Elise to the test here and her ability to bring everybody in and out. Hey, Scott, let's talk about the farm gate realities here on this budget. From the farmer's perspective or standpoint, what part of this budget will farmers feel first? Like, is it better or worse?
To be honest, I think, going down further that line of unsure, I honestly don't think farmers are going to feel much difference in the short term, one way or the other here. I think there's elements that, depending on how things roll out and our ability to, capitalize on infrastructure investments, there could be a lot of opportunity down the road. But similarly with the spending cuts, as Tyler said, I think there's a reality where we could see some impact right away or in the next coming years from some loss of opportunity for support for, everything from climate solutions or, productivity enhancements. If I was really looking at the budget right now as a farmer, I think the most immediate opportunity I see is in some of the tax incentives Christina referenced earlier around the productivity super enhancement or whatever the terminology they're using for it is these days, but it's essentially accelerated capital cost allowance. I think anything that will allow people to invest sooner is great, but at the same time, tax incentives only benefit you if you're in a tax positive environment from the get-go. So there's a lot of questions, I think, more than anything, and I don't think there's a whole lot here that's going to hit the rubber to the road right away.
Yeah, in that acceleration of the depreciation that, for a lot of ranchers where the money has been very positive in this past year, they'll really maybe be able to take advantage of that once implemented. Let's talk about program reform, Scott. Ottawa framed its departmental saving plan here as like streamlining. We saw programs like Living Labs, for example, are, they're getting the boot, they're out the door. Do you see this as a smarter delivery of service, or is this kind of erosion of farm programs and research?
My sense is it's going to be a little bit of both at the end of the day. I think flagging research in the language certainly got my level of concern up a little bit because I think, one of the challenges we've articulated for some time is I don't think we as a sector with government have had a really comprehensive conversation about what's the future of our research and development and innovation plan. And so I think when you look at just the suggestion that research could be in the offing, I think there's a real concern that we may throw the baby out with the bathwater here if we're not being strategic. So I think, yes, I hope to see some of both in terms of cuts to, programs that maybe are ineffective, but I don't see, given the quantum we're talking about in terms of a 15% reduction, that you can do this with just administrative streamlining. I think there's going to be inherently some loss of producer support and programming that's going to take place as well. I think what's critical is we need to get clarity on, what's driving that process strategically moving forward and ensure that we get ahead of some of these things. And it's already too little too late probably, but we should have had that research conversation 10 years ago.
Yeah, and then when it comes to cuts, I think it's kind of human nature. If you were to ask whether it's farmers and ranchers or it's people outside the industry, do we want to see a more balanced budget or more fiscal restraint? Do people buy into the austerity comments the Prime Minister has made? People are like, oh yeah, absolutely. And then when we get to the cut portion, it's like, oh no, I want the cuts to be over there, not over here in agriculture.
Yeah, not for me. Everybody else can deal with cuts, but that is, to your point, human nature. And I think there's an inevitability that there will be some hurt with this no matter what. But at the same time, hopefully there is some opportunity to streamline administration for a number of reasons that can be a positive. But when I look at that in the context of what I see happening in the EU, for example, where they're talking about simplification of a lot of their programs, I think that language in the EU is very much code for cuts happening at the same time. So I think that my suggestion is there's no world in which we're going to get one or the other. It's going to be a combination of both.
Yeah, and we haven't even talked about the overlay here of having to increase defense spending at the same time that we're also cutting, and there's that's a factor as well.
I think what Tyler said earlier, this is a complex budget with a lot of little pieces in it. It's going to take a long time, I think, to fully unpack all the implications of the different elements that you see in this budget and what they mean for our sector.
Okay, last one. We've heard a lot from the Prime Minister about competitiveness. Does this increase the competitiveness of Canadian agriculture for farmers and ranchers on the global stage?
Unsure, to be seen. I think it really is incumbent upon. So you see significant investments in market diversification, trade enabling infrastructure, investments in our regulators to help with trade. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but at the end of the day, I think we need to be able to demonstrate and reflect on that agriculture was actually a priority in those investments. And that's going to be the ultimate, determination of whether this supports increased competitiveness or if this is another missed opportunity for our sector.
Yeah, great point. If anybody has questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get as many of those to our panelists as possible. Scott, we'll get back to you in the group session, okay? Thanks a lot. Up next, let's bring in Christina Farrell. She's the CEO of Food and Beverage Canada. Christina, it's great to have you on here and provide your portion of the industry's perspective on this. A lot of times we talk about the primary or the impacts on the primary part of the industry, but the food and beverage sector, a key component upstream for sure. So did anything in this budget move the needle for food processors looking to expand or modernize in Canada?
I think somewhat. Again, part of the equation is seeing if the budget actually passes next week, which it's always fun for gossip here in Ottawa. There were some promising, though, as Scott referenced again, the signals on the tax incentives, there's support to GAC and CFIA to support expanding and restoring trade access. Again, all of that helps with investment confidence, but we're still really missing that big policy vision from this government for what they want to see from an industry 5 years from now.
Okay. Yeah, good point in a passing. Yet that story is yet to be written. So
Yeah.
a big issue for the primary part of the industry, but also food and beverage as well as labor shortages.
Yeah.
And it's really a choke point. Was there any meaningful signal or funding to help attract and retain workers in your portion of the sector?
Unclear. There was one positive announcement in Budget 2025. It was the one-time pathway for up to 33,000 workers who have open work permits right now in Canada to permanent residency, which is great news. But again, we're still waiting details, what that actually means for us. Will it be workers in our industry, or is it going to go to other industries that don't necessarily complement ours? The cuts to the temporary residents, that's something that we saw in Budget 2025. We saw more in the immigration levels plan, which came out the day after, so really big week. Those are concerning too, because they're going to have to decide at some point how we're going to get to those numbers, and our food security could be at risk depending on how they do it.
Yeah, there is a lot of discussion right now about, trying to fill some of these labor gaps.
Yeah.
And sometimes the answers are don't necessarily fit some of the narratives that are being discussed in the mainstream. It's a real challenge to get the message across to the government at a time like this, isn't it?
Yes, of course. And we'll have government officials who suggest to us, well, The labor numbers don't necessarily reflect what we're saying as an industry, and it's because we need to look at food and beverage manufacturing separate from auto manufacturing, from any of the other sectors as well. And then we'll have government officials who suggest, well, we're seeing layoffs at other employers, big employers in the banking sector and other sectors. Isn't there a pathway for those people to transition to our industry? And it's not that simple, especially when a lot of our jobs are located in rural and remote ridings.
Yeah, and one thing that I noticed in this budget, and maybe this would be, if you were to go back and ask Mark Carney from 2 years ago, you may get a little bit of maybe some different messaging, but a reduction in some of the climate focus,
Yeah.
right? And that was a big push for him. He even had a book authored about the topic, but there was a little bit of a push for greener manufacturing and pushing that for sure. And from a packaging standpoint, how is that viewed by an organization like Food and Beverage Canada? Is that something you're supportive of, or is that something that's just adding more costs into the system?
Well, I appreciate the angle they took on the climate plan. It was a climate competitiveness strategy, which seems to infer that competitiveness will be the lens that they look at our climate policy through. But there was actually very little on some of the things that impact us. I don't think plastics was mentioned once in the entire budget. That's huge for us from a packaging perspective. That's something this previous government really focused on, was really driving a lot of policy on as well. And they've been pretty silent on it since the election. We didn't necessarily see any funds directed to support companies and looking at packaging alternatives either, which could be promising. It might mean that there's a change in direction now, but remains to be seen.
Give me something that Food and Beverage Canada would have been pushing for pre-budget release that you did not see in the budget.
The domestic processing fund, which was the really big one. They had committed to $200 million, which isn't nearly enough what the industry needs, but it is something that we were trying to get across to be one of their priorities, and it looks like it wasn't.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we'll come back to you in a second. Let's bring Tyler McCann from CAPI, your opening host here of this webinar. And once again, to everybody, make sure you put your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. Okay, Tyler, what does this budget reveal about the federal government's long-term policy direction for agriculture and food?
I think, Shaun, what it tells us is that the government's plan is effectively more of the same. When we look at the decisions that they're making, they largely reflect the path that Canadian agriculture policy and programs have been on for 25 years at this point in time, right? It is about some more subsidies for risk management programming. It's about a little bit of effort on regulatory reform. It's about kind of more of a focus on trade and trade diversification. And so someone earlier referenced a kind of a big vision for the sector. I think what we got from the government is a view that the vision that's in place today is the vision that's going to continue to be there. And I think if we want to see a different vision, it does kind of fall back on the sector to say, look, we need to stop how we've been doing things and do things different. The government is not stepping up and doing that this way through the budget. Again, I think they're really just responding to what they've heard from stakeholders about concerns.
Okay, so to counter that, though, had they presented a budget that really shook the tree, like it really made a lot of people super uncomfortable, and was this radical or very aggressive move in a new direction for Canada, how would that have been received?
So I think it depends on kind of what radical means, right? And I'm not sure that this budget isn't radical. I think some of the cuts that the department may undertake and CFIA may undertake may be radical, depending on how they are. It's unfortunate that the one thing that they highlighted for a cut was living labs. I'm not sure that is where I would have gone to first to cut spending inside the department. But there may be some things in there that are pretty radical and that do kind of pull the department back or really reshape the role that it plays. Again, we don't know enough details on that to know yet. Again, I think that there is an appetite to do things differently. You can do things differently and do things better. I think that even within the cuts, there is a chance for this to be, again, another step forward in doing things better, at least. But again, it's still too early to tell. Hopefully, we won't have to wait much longer. The clerk of the Privy Council effectively sent an email to the bureaucracy effectively saying, once we know this budget will pass, we will release details quickly to give you certainty about what all of these cuts mean. And so we're getting to that point where we know that this is locked and loaded, and we should know more then.
Yeah, interesting in terms of letting go of those reins or holding the reins tight. Some of those metaphors. Okay, let's talk about trade, Tyler. A lot of talk about fiscal restraint. It's very front and center here. Does this budget strengthen or weaken Canada's trade competitiveness relative to some of our major trading partners?
So it looks like a $5 billion investment in a trade infrastructure fund will go a long way to improving our trade competitiveness. It looks like some of those investments in the CFIA will help trade competitiveness. Again, I think both of those are not short-term measures. Some of these trade infrastructure investments will take years to have an impact on the sector. So that's a long-term play. It's worth noting that if you look at what Australia spends as a percent of their GDP on trade infrastructure compared to what Canada spends as a part of its GDP on trade infrastructure, they're spending about, we would have had to spend $20 billion more a year to catch up with the investments that they're making. We're not there yet. We're $5 billion over a period of 7 years. And so it's a different game. Like this is a significant step forward when it comes to trade infrastructure investment, but this isn't a generational game-changing investment in trade infrastructure. And I think, again, we get into this big question around where's that money going to get spent? Carlo Dade, when he was at the Canada West Foundation, led quite a bit of work around a Canada trade infrastructure plan, and they were really trying to say we need to shift from shovel-ready projects to shovel-worthy projects.
Yeah.
Again, we need to take more of a strategic approach to this. We don't know yet whether or not that's going to be the approach the government takes. It'll be interesting to see the role that the Major Projects Office plays in all of this too.
Yeah, big shout to Carlo. He's a big proponent of do not tell me that we're going to do a whole bunch of shovel-ready projects because that is not strategic. That just means they've passed they've got through some of the regulatory. It doesn't mean they're strategic whatsoever. So be careful there. So many initiatives require cross-departmental cooperation. Where do you see the budget risks of good ideas getting lost in some of the execution?
I think that there is huge risk when it comes to implementation for this budget. One of the things that the government, the new government, has done is continually gone outside of the existing civil service to fix the problems that they see. They launched the Major Projects Office, pulling someone from outside of government to do it. They launched Build Canada Homes, pulling someone from outside of government to do it. They've launched a new defense investment agency, pulling someone from outside of government to do it. And so I think it speaks to concerns that the Prime Minister and his team have around how the civil service can implement and deliver on these cuts. Like if you go back to our discussions about what does that mean for science and innovation and how strategic and what does that engagement look like, it will be interesting to see whether or not that falls on the existing team inside AAFC to look at things differently. I think we've seen this on regulatory reform over the last couple of months, that when you ask the regulators that have been regulating the system for 20 years to come up with new ideas for regulatory reform, they may not be the best at it. And so I think that there's this huge risk that as the public service goes through changes, that we're going to run into implementation issues, and none of this will move as fast or as strategically as we would like it to at the end of the day.
Okay, let's bring in the whole gang. Bring everybody together here, and let's get to our group session part of the program here, and encourage everybody. We've got some questions coming in. Really do appreciate it. Keep them coming, and we'll thread them in throughout the rest of the webinar discussion here. A lot of because we're agricultural focused, I'm just curious, and maybe whoever wants to tackle this can. We talk about, did agriculture get the attention it needs? Blah 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 blah. If we were to pick out an industry that really got attention in this budget, who would we say? Is there a clear winner based on what we know at this point?
Defense.
Yeah.
I think it's the clear winner.
Yeah, that's probably where I would go to.
Critical minerals to some extent as well,
Right.
but it certainly wasn't food.
I would say generally, though, it was sort of outside of those, very sector agnostic in some respects. And I think
Yeah.
that's part of the challenge we have as a sector to deal with now, is that we're fighting the fight across all these different programmatic areas with everyone else that wasn't necessarily flagged for particular attention either.
And if you look at the intro to the budget, like the kind of the language that in theory sets the stage for everything that comes from it, it does mention agri-food as a strategic asset for the country. It does talk about it in the same context as it talks about critical minerals. It doesn't see that same follow through, but I think it's a bit of an example where I think we often want some acknowledgement of the sector as a strategic asset for the country. It's not enough just to ask for that acknowledgement. We need to ask for more than that, because I would say there's, the government has acknowledged that agri-food's a strategic sector. But again, that's a very, very small step. It's this big question around what comes next at the end of the day.
Yeah,
Well, and
there's
frankly, that identification, sorry, Shaun, happened. I mean, the Barton report in 2017 made essentially the same case. And I know that was technically not government itself, but I mean, this isn't the first time we've heard language articulating this. So,
yeah, but I think the question to that point, Scott, though, is we got to get past the being happy people talking about us stage.
Yeah.
Right? We got to get to the old thing called action and execution and implementation. And that's, we have to have the environment, the context, the situation to be able to do that, but, to be, seize the moment and make that the reality. But yeah, we just seem to be still caught in the, hey, they mentioned us. That's great, sort of stuff. Got a question here from Tabitha. Maybe Christine, I'll throw it your way first. As innovation helps drive competitiveness and productivity, are there opportunities within this budget to support innovation uptake in the agriculture, food, and beverage sectors?
I think it'll be that productivity super deduction piece that we saw, those tax incentives. Ideally, we'll see movement on that in a Budget Implementation Act 1, although the timing of that really depends as well. But I think that'll be the key thing in terms of innovation for us.
Great. Anybody else?
I would just note that it's a double-edged sword, but the spending cut is going to drive change around research and innovation, and that could be more problematic than good, but there is an opportunity, if done right, to drive some gains for innovation. If it spurs a conversation about a real tangible, explicit roadmap for innovation and success moving forward, then that could be a net positive, but that's a lot of ifs right now.
Yeah.
And I think what we've always tried to say, that whether or not we're spending more, the same, or less, we need to start to talk about spending better. And that innovation spaces are really ripe for how do we spend better? How do we get a more coherent kind of vision of where the department wants to, where the government, not just the department, but where the government wants to see investments, where the government is kind of creating the conditions for the private sector to invest more. And it's not clear that this is going to be a spend better budget yet. Again, I think that comes when we start to see more of those details around how they're going to reposition the department's role.
Maybe if I could
Yeah, go ahead, Christina.
Maybe if I can follow Tyler too, our definition of innovation is not the same as the government's definition of innovation, in particular for food and beverage manufacturing as well as primary ag. We saw that with ISED's Strategic Innovation Fund. Only one food company was ever successful, and there's not a lot of them that could have met the parameters around that large-scale program of funding and support. It's now the Strategic Response Fund, which again, I'm a bit hesitant to say whether or not it'll help us or not, but again, the focus does not look to be like it's innovation or support for food and beverage manufacturing. So we really do operate in a challenging space right now.
Okay, can you just, for those of us that aren't super into what's going on with the food and beverage sector, how do you define innovation versus how the government defines it?
The government is really patent creation and new innovation that doesn't exist yet that we could be a competitive edge in Canada. Our definition of innovation can sometimes just be adopting a new innovation for you as a company. You're a small, medium company using something that large companies across the globe are now using, a new application of a technology. We're not necessarily creating new patents in food and beverage manufacturing, but that doesn't play into the government's understanding of what we need for funding.
When we look at the alignment versus the gaps on what we heard from this budget, is there alignment or is there disconnects between producers, processors, and policymakers on what needs to happen here? Tyler, start with you.
I think that there is disconnect. I think one of the challenges has always been that the sector itself doesn't have a clear sense of what needs to happen, right? I think that is as much as kind of every link of the chain talks about these are things that we need. We don't do a very good job talking about them as a big picture. I'll pick on the agri-stability investment as an example of this, where it's one thing to say, yes, we want to try and fix agri-stability, and yes, we want to invest more, but we should probably find a way to say, okay, if the government's going to spend $100 million more in agriculture and food, is agri-stability really the best place for that money to go? And to be honest, I would argue that it's not. That's not kind of the first place I would invest a new dollar to have an impact. And so I think Shaun, that that's where part of that disconnect comes from, is that we all have kind of many different asks depending on the context that we're being asked about. And again, in the ag context, the provinces play a pretty big role on these things as well. And it doesn't create an opportunity to say, actually, if we want to get strategic investments in the sector, this is where we think it is. And that's the struggle that the sector has.
Christina, do you have a thought there?
Yeah, I think from the producers and processor side, like I like to think I'm on the same page as a Tyler, as a Scott, and I think for the most part we really are. But I think there's a huge disconnect as to how the government sees us and treats us, and in some cases takes us for granted. For food and beverage manufacturing, we're actually the country's largest manufacturing sector and largest manufacturing employer, but you won't see us getting the same attention as auto or any of the other manufacturing sectors. And our home isn't really an ISED like the other sectors as well. So I think there's a huge disconnect.
Now, Scott, you've got experience here because you're representing, farmers, ranchers from across the country. There are vast differences amongst how that group feels about different topics. We are not, I have to say and compare it to, we're not the airline sector. When the airline sector goes into Ottawa, they're like, here's what we want, here's what we need, because one, there's less of them, and they're all kind of the same. Agriculture is so diverse, that diversity, which is an advantage, when it comes to what is your ask, what is your want, that's where that becomes much more of a challenge.
Yeah, and I think the reality is it's not a process like I think fragmentation in our sector, and I think the question earlier about is there a discrepancy between process? I think it's not along processing and primary lines. It's just that there's many voices all saying slightly different things. I think we all, and you saw in the Let's Grow Canada letter that went out earlier this summer, at the highest level, we all agree on what needs to happen. I think it's when you get down to the specific investment level where it gets very tricky and you start getting that deluge of diverse voices that can water each other out and you kind of lose focus as a sector. And that's why I think so much of what we see in this budget, there is opportunity there, but can we overcome that inertia of everyone sort of residing back to the provincial interests of their respective part of the sector versus taking a step back and saying, can we collectively come together beyond just rhetoric and 50,000 foot language that we agree on and actually say, here are the 3 things we need, or in reaction to the budget, here's the 5 things that we really want to see as focal points moving forward to see that realized. And I think we're doing better in that regard than we have for quite some time, but it's a process that's going to take time. There's a lot of issues in our sector that divide elements of us. They certainly are far outweighed by what unites the sector, but at the same time, that's not an easy conversation to have when you have in excess of hundreds and hundreds of groups all representing aspects of our industry across the different value chain across Canada.
But I think beyond that, there's also a challenge where the sector hasn't made the same pivot that the government has around we need to move away from spending to investment, right? Like this idea that the government is going to catalyze private sector investment, to use the Prime Minister's language. And I think even if it, kind of we're in the space of the Conservatives and the Liberals are still kind of talking the same way these days. They're just going to use different kind of approaches to catalyzing that investment. But to be honest, at times catalyzing investment and trying to drive more private sector investment in agriculture and agri-food doesn't kind of fit the traditional way we talk about support for the sector, right? Like I think it's easy in the food manufacturing context, in the agribusiness context, to talk about how do we encourage more investment. But if you look at, again, the traditional ag space, that is a bit of a different frame that I think people don't fully have their heads wrapped around what does that really look like, because farmers actually do a pretty good job of investing in their businesses as long as conditions are good. But investment tends not to be a huge challenge on farm. Maybe that will be different in the world that we're living in over the next couple of years, though.
Well, I do think that investment piece, though, Shaun, sorry to interrupt you there, but it harkens to the infrastructure side of things as much as anything. I mean, the on-farm degree of investment is happening. I agree completely. Farmers are, renowned for, if you have available cash, putting it back into your operation. It's our ability to attract investment into some of those common goods that we need to really advance our sector that I think is going to be the real challenge we face moving forward.
Yeah, and when you think about that infrastructure, that $5 billion, Tyler referenced Australia. I think of what Brazil and Argentina are doing. We need to be paying more attention to what some of our competitors are doing and making sure that we are, keeping as much as possible our competitive edges. And I think our ability to, as much as we we throw shade on it once in a while in terms of what's going on with the grain transportation sector, for example. It is one of our competitive advantages, or it should be, and we need to make sure we're leveraging and moving it forward as much as possible and not resting on our laurels like it's always going to be this way. That's my editorial thoughts. Let's talk about trade, okay? The budget puts fresh emphasis on exports beyond the U.S. This is a big issue for the Prime Minister as he talks about trying to double non-U.S. trade in a very short period of time. What practical steps should the sector take now to seize some of those opportunities? Scott, you want to go first?
Well, I think that this is a prime example where talking about agriculture as one entity makes it very challenging because there's some sectors that there's no world in which that's even going to be remotely possible. And I think we just have to accept that reality. But there's others where this is an example where it actually, I think, requires engagement at that subsector level to really come forward and say, these are the 2 or 3 things we need to really, here's the opportunity, here's the market we're focused on, and here's what's needed to execute on that. I think more generally, there's an overarching sense that, high value premium markets are where we need to focus our time, but that doesn't give much direction. So it really does just fall down on clarity of intention and purpose and finding opportunities where they exist. The challenge I think we have is the world is in such a churn geopolitically that you're looking at, okay, where are all those US soybeans going to land and what does that mean for me in the short term? So it's a challenging conversation. There's not an easy solution to that, but at the end of the day, this is an area where I don't think as a sector you can speak as a whole. This is really going to come down to the exact value chain and where they see opportunities.
Christina, what's your thoughts?
Well, there were some interesting announcements in the budget. In particular, like there was a new SME export readiness initiative for ISED. That's something that I think that companies could look to see how they could take advantage of it. But we still need to be reminded that the US is always going to be a significant market for us. That's not going to change, even if we do have new trade agreements with new countries. Something that we still don't have an answer to, though, is what happens when our trade infrastructure faces labor disruptions, as we've seen with our railways and otherwise. That undermines confidence in our ability to export. And we still don't have a solution as to how we mitigate those challenges.
And I
Tyler,
would just
thoughts?
add, maybe
Or,
just
sorry,
before
go ahead,
jumping in
Scott.
before Tyler there, but the one area as well is the Buy Canadian policy. I think it's something that we should be looking at very carefully because I think if you look at it in terms of, for example, were they to have defined volumes of need for agricultural products, agri-food goods, like that can provide a really fundamental contribution, not just to trade diversification, but also to your risk management. I mean, that's a defined source of revenue and volume of sales that you can then build exports on top of and everything else. So I think we really should be looking very closely at that as another area where as a sector, we need to get in and get really clear, provide clear direction to government on the opportunity and the benefit that can afford to our sector.
And that is a space that Canada seems to lag behind other similar competitors around how do we better leverage procurement in different places to support the sector. And again, it's not always easy, but there are ways that I think that we could do it better. But one of the things, again, there are a whole series of measures when it comes to trade diversification where the government is trying, I think, to change the game. It goes beyond the Trade Infrastructure Fund. Christina mentioned the SME investment. I mentioned earlier creating new bureaucratic structures. They've created a new strategic trade office inside Global Affairs. Again, it's not clear to me how that's going to be different than the Trade Commissioner's office or these other kind of structures that are there. But I think kind of doubling down on this idea of we need to take a more strategic approach. We need higher level engagement. We need kind of more senior coordination inside government. And so they do seem to be wanting to push these things forward. But I know FCC put out a report a couple of weeks ago looking at the potential for diversification away from the United States. I continue to be a skeptic, I suppose, at the end of the day. Again, it's one thing for the Prime Minister to set a target to double exports beyond the United States. But up until the point that USMCA gets ripped up and we lose the preferential market access, I think we need to be realistic that it will continue to be the most valuable, most reliable, most secure market for most Canadian food and agriculture exports. So why would we diversify away in the meantime?
Isn't it? Aren't the numbers like something like Canada has like $600 billion in exports a year to the US, and like European Union's like 30 and China's like 35?
Yes, and our export concentration in the US market has gone up over the last 10 years. We are more concentrated than we were. And again, and for good reason. So this is, again, I think that this is the tension, is that we may end up putting a lot of efforts into market diversification, thinking that the US relationship is going to fall apart, but it hasn't yet. And I don't know. I'm not willing to, I guess, put bets around what this looks like next summer. But I think that is the tension. And I suppose, Christina, it's one of the things I've been wondering about on the food processing sector, where how do you get companies to take advantage of this productivity super tax credit that they've announced when we don't have much certainty around kind of what does that market access look like with the United States and how reliable is it? Like that's got to be clouding judgments around investment decisions.
So much uncertainty. And I think at the end of the day, we have other things too. Like even for a company that wants to export across provinces, some of that trade enabling infrastructure might help that, but it's still cheaper to export into the US. But I think the makeup of our industry too, about 92% of food and beverage manufacturers in this country are considered small. A lot of them aren't even at the stage yet where they should be looking at exporting. So how do we support those companies beyond everything else of looking at other markets?
Helping them use, access some of the trade agreements we already have in place,
Yep.
right?
When this is
Yeah.
again where I think procurement can play a large role. I think if you look at the budget, I mean, there's a commitment to buy Canadian and also one to do a national school food program on a permanent basis. I mean, there's some evident areas where you can examine an opportunity for a sector that helps to build that capacity and they help upscale some of those SMEs to a place where they may be export ready.
Hey, Tyler, got a question here, trade related from Stephen. Stephen says canola is dependent on the Chinese market access somewhat. Why? Would investments into, say, a canola processing facility at a cooperative be a more effective way for Canada to secure additional markets?
So, I mean, I think the reason why Canada is dependent on China is because it's a valuable market for Canadian canola. I think often people think about China as a low value market, but on a variety of different products, it's actually can be a premium market as well. Like there's a lot of reasons why people do business with China. We did see the biofuels production incentive inside the budget as a way to try and stimulate some of that domestic demand. I think again, there's a bit of a debate in the sector around what incremental demand will be created through that incentive, but it does put a little bit more gas into that engine, that economic engine around domestic production. Again, I think it's there. I think we often take for granted the role that this domestic crush capacity could play. But again, we've got some broader economic conditions in that sector that may be holding investment back as well. What's happening in the United States matters. But again, it's good to see that biofuels production incentive, but I think that there's potential for them to go further if we really want to try and displace some of that export demand with more domestic demand for canola.
Yeah.
And worth noting, and I think that the question may have referenced it, I think we often talk just about canola tariffs, but again, if you're a pulse producer in this country, if you're a seafood producer, if you're a pork producer, you're also struggling with these tariffs as well. And I think that I do wonder a bit if the government's got itself kind of too caught up in the canola dynamic and is missing out on how are we responding more effectively to all of these other trade disruptions that we're facing, and what does a more kind of comprehensive approach that recognizes the disruption across agriculture rather than just talking about just canola all of the time.
Well, look at peas. They've got tariffs from India. They got tariffs from China. It's peas taking on the chin. Sear has a question here. Canada is becoming increasingly uncompetitive in food production, both fisheries and agriculture, agri-foods, and we commonly dissuade investment owing to regulatory uncertainty. I do not see anything in the budget to really support the ag and agri-food sectors. Question to the panelists: how do we get the attention of this government to increase competitiveness and encourage investment in Canadian ag and agri-food? Christine, why don't we start with you?
We're really trying. We're doing a lot from the advocacy side of things to try to make it clear to this government the importance of our collective industries, but also how we can't necessarily take it for granted, which I think has been the case for a while. And it's really just continuing those efforts as much as we can and in partnership. And I know that Tyler's referenced it a few times too. It's really coming together and understanding that the government's hearing all of these different asks. How can we be united on some of the things that we're asking the government to help move those forward?
Scott?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more on that. I think at the end of the day, we've made some inroads on working together as a sector with the Let's Grow Canada initiative. But at the same time, I think if it comes across as just superficial alignment and there's not heft behind that, it doesn't move us forward. So we have to go further. And I think it also requires a real focus on, we hear it time and again, but this government is very data driven, and we need to do our homework and demonstrate at a higher order level, not just federally, nationally, but regionally, what some of the opportunities are for the things we're asking about for in our sector and what that really means in terms of economic opportunity. I think as much as our productivity growth historically and our resilience have been, benefits for our sector, there are also opportunities for government to say, look at how resilient you are. You guys have been managing through all of this. Let's keep things going. And you seem to be growing economically year on year, one way or the other. And I think we need to really identify what some of the constraints on growth are, but also very with precision and depth what some of the opportunity is. And it has to be back-ended by the sector actually coming together and speaking to a selection of a few priorities, not 30, 40, 50.
But I think that often this takes pressure off of the work of agriculture ministers. Again, I think that there's too much of a sense of, again, we need the prime minister or finance minister to do something big. We need to see that generational investment. And again, I think I will put actually that kind of that food manufacturing investment in a bit of a different box because we don't invest a lot in that space. But it is important to remember that we do invest quite a bit in the agriculture department. The department's budget is $3.5 billion a year. The regulatory reform mandates exist within ministers themselves. They don't need the prime minister or the finance minister to do things. I think to be honest, we take too much pressure off of the federal agriculture minister, and there was a question, a reference to provincial ag ministers
I'm
in
going
the
there
Q&A.
next.
But
Yeah.
so we take too much pressure off of agriculture ministers to say, again, how can we get them to do a better job of what they're doing and kind of take priority and action within their own mandates? And instead we drift to, we need something kind of big and more significant. And I really do think that takes too much of the pressure off of the ag ministers themselves.
Well, and I think that is, I mean, if you look at the budget, if you look at what ag groups and agri-food groups are articulating where the missed opportunity was, it was on some of those areas that are more kind of small baseball that really matter to farmers, really matter to food businesses, but don't necessarily resonate as those big transformative investments. And that's where we saw a lot of missed opportunity, I would say.
Yeah. Well, let's get to Tabitha's question. It's a good one. How will the provincial ministers of agriculture view this budget from their perspective? Of course, we're speculating here, but what is our thoughts? Scott?
Well, I think in simplest terms, if I'm a provincial ag minister and we're approaching negotiations for the next policy framework, I'm going to be looking very closely at the level of federal spending in agriculture. And I think there's always an argument to be had about, shared jurisdiction and equal parts here. So whether it materializes in the policy framework or not, and certainly there's some indication that could be the case, I think the concern here is that it could knock-on effect of reduced investment across the board because there's a finger-pointing exercise of saying, well, you're spending less. Why are we going to step up and spend more in this space? So I think that, to me, that's the number one concern off the bat.
Yeah. Christina, what do you think?
Honestly, fully agree with Scott. Nothing else to really add on there. I think that will be the tensions that we see.
Yeah. Tyler, what are your thoughts?
I think if you look at where the spending reductions happen and what their annual profile is, it does seem like some of those spending reductions ramp up just at the same time as the new policy framework is going to come into effect. Again, this is speculation because none of these details are available, but it does look like Ag Canada is planning to spend less in the policy framework. And so I think that probably makes provincial ministers happy because it takes some pressure off of them. I think the agri-stability increases should make provincial ministers happy because it responds to something that they've agreed to already. I mean, effectively, that isn't a new announcement. They already agreed around the table. Trade diversification should make them happy. This should be a good thing as well. And again, I will say that I think that ultimately, I think it's actually a bit unfortunate that provincial ministers may be very satisfied with this budget because it speaks to, once again, they don't have, I don't think, a very ambitious direction or kind of goal that they would like to see ag policy and programs go in this country, right? I haven't heard many provincial ministers kind of championing the cause of agriculture either. We like to pick on the federal government, but this is an issue provincially as well.
And I think point about agri-stability is even you raised earlier about where $100 million needs to be spent. I think there's some nuance to that as well. And that, I think the improvements that were made, I mean, there's no question they'll help some producers here, but that was not a clarion call from industry saying this is what we need to see addressed in agri-stability. I think there's a sense of fiscal constraint in what's realistic and responsible from a governmental perspective, driving a lot of the more recent investments in BRM. It's not to say that they're not positive, but would they be the first thing industry was asking for? I think there's some difference or gap between what people are looking for in those programs and what's actually happening through those negotiations at an FPT level.
And don't we have to get out of this trap where we're judging how much support the federal government gives to the sector based on how much they're spending inside the sector? Like we want them to be responsible with the dollars. We want there to be results and an impact based on the dollars being spent, but then we're not really focusing a lot on what those KPIs are or the evaluation of those dollars. So if to me, if the money's being spent more effectively on the sector and it's providing based on, better results at the end of the day, a better outcome, I'm okay with less money being spent. It's sort of like managing a payroll of a sports team. You don't, outside of the Dodgers where they do have the highest payroll, but there's a lot of situations where it is not the highest payroll team that wins the championship. It's a team, it's you manage the payroll, you manage the expenses, and you look for the results from those dollars spent. I think that's where more attention needs to be paid, Scott. Or am I off base?
Well, no, I mean, it's very simple terms. I mean, all the BRM programs are demand driven. And if you really want to see a year of big spending, that's a demonstration that something's going wrong in the sector economically. So I think at the end of the day, so much of the cost shared agreement occurs in BRM. I mean, we should all be hoping for less spending. That's not to say we want less supportive programming. But if you are taking that sort of framework of investment versus expense, the idea here is that we're making generational investments that build resilience and competitiveness, so you're not relying as heavily on those programs. So it doesn't mean cutting programming, it means reducing reliance on them over time by supporting the sector to do better through other means. And that's why I don't think it's a significant opportunity. I'm not going to overstate it, but I do think Buy Canadian and elements like that can really be foundational elements of reducing reliance on other programs, for example.
Yeah. Okay, we got a few minutes left here. Really appreciate all the questions that are pouring in here. Value-added growth. We haven't talked about that at all, or not as much. Does the budget finally help shift Canada from exporting raw commodities to producing more food here at home? Tyler, your thoughts?
Maybe, and it depends if Christina's members are going to invest, right? One of the interesting things that gets
it's on you, Christina. It's all on you.
It's all, but this is it, right? I think one of the things that's interesting when you read the budget as a whole, there's this clear signal that government has an understanding of what it can do. Government wants to catalyze, but what government really wants to do is encourage private sector investment. I think that they are really kind of repositioning the role of government to say what our job is to do is to create the conditions so that value-added companies invest more. They are trying to do this through these tax credits. They are trying to do this largely outside of the budget around regulatory changes. They are trying to deliver on this repositioning. But again, if you read the budget, they're really, I think, pretty honest and open about the economic challenges that Canada faces. It talks about the impact of trade and what that's doing for investment in manufacturing. And so I'm not sure, kind of in this context of uncertainty, how great that productivity super tax credit would need to be to actually kind of get companies to say, look, we're going to make a big investment. But this is it, right? I think the budget has, in theory, set the stage. Now it's up to the private sector to do more. And that is different in the Canadian context. I don't think that we've seen federal governments be as explicit about their expectation of private sector investment.
I wonder if maybe there should have been more of a tackling of what corporate tax rates are. And if you wanted to lure
again, I think what the federal government would say, what they say pretty explicitly in the budget is, with these additional tax credits, we have some of the most competitive corporate tax rates in the world today.
Okay, Christina.
So, again, like will companies invest? I think there's other things that'll influence that. It's not just the US and what happens there. It's even are you going to invest or expand your plant if you don't know if you'll have the labor that you need to keep operating, right? And that's still a big unanswered question for us too.
Yeah. Daryl in the Q&A here, he calls you Mr. Ross, Scott. That's very official. Mr. Ross has alluded to the fragmentation within the industry and how it often stifles our efforts to communicate effectively with the government. We have allowed fragmentation to replace focus. Each group guards its territory and its message, even as our collective influence erodes. This conversation has endured for decades. We talk but don't act on it. What are some of the steps we can take to solve this issue? I'm not sure we have time to answer the question, but Mike, who chimes in and replies, says a huge long-term issue. In the few minutes that we have left before we conclude, if you could tell Prime Minister Carney one thing the sector needs most before, that's the wrong question I was going to ask. I apologize. Take it as a whole. Is budget 2025 a net positive, neutral, or setback for the ag food system, and why? Let's sum it up. Your thoughts, Christina, you first.
Cautiously positive, helpful signals again on productivity and trade, but missing support specifically for food and beverage manufacturing. And again, like we still have those labor and investment gaps. So a lot to be seen.
Yeah, kind of that's fitting into the unsure people that voted earlier. Scott, for you?
I mean, I would echo much of the same sentiment. I think there's also a lot of attention needed to remain on red tape reduction and where that goes next. I think we need to see more ambition and a lot further. If we're talking about capital investment and capital attraction, I think like red tape reduction is going to be a huge driver of that. So it's separate from the budget in some respects, but we need to see that go further and faster.
Not to pick on our European friends, but when you have European companies saying they won't come to Canada because of the regulatory environment, that should be a massive wake-up call.
Well, whether it's access to innovation coming into the country that others have access to from a competitiveness standpoint, or our own innovators leaving our country to commercialize products because they can't get to market, I think there's just countless examples where we're shooting ourselves in the foot here.
Tyler, what's your thoughts?
So I think overall it's a positive, but it's not this big generational change the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister alluded to. I think it is a pivot and a step in the right direction as a whole. I think in agriculture, it's a step in the right direction. I'm not sure it's much of a pivot. One of the things that is not going to be a big deal to most people in this country, but I think really will matter, is what's going to happen with public service renewal through this budget. I think that there's this sense that this isn't just about reducing the size of the public service, but changing how it works. And I think a more effective bureaucracy will have a really long-term benefit that we may not appreciate every day. But again, it's not clear that they're going to be able to deliver that.
And one of the differences between Canada and the US, Tyler, you and I have looked at some of the numbers. The USDA, for example, has been cutting back on federal staff, but they're spread out really across the country. In Canada, there is a high concentration. Over 80% of federal workers are in the Ottawa area. That is going to be an interesting look at where those cuts are made.
Yeah, and I think it got a bit of an apples and oranges comparison because the USDA's got a different mandate. But again, I think it speaks to if Ag Canada is going to pull back on science and more of that kind of capacity across the country, I do think that will send the wrong signal. And I really hope that we see a more thoughtful approach there.
I think Tyler and I are going to wrap up here, but Scott and Christina, thank you so much for joining us here today for this webinar. This has been a fun, lively discussion. Okay, Tyler, I think now, like to wrap up, my thought is like, there was a lot of promotion and anticipation leading up to this budget, but now the real work kind of begins. The implementation and trying to answer a lot of the questions that have been created. We have a lot of people, unsure about what this budget actually means, and now the real work begins for this government.
And I think it's interesting. I think that there is kind of a common reaction to the budget. Again, one of the questions that came in talked about kind of the fragmentation, but I think by and large, Scott and Christina, representing farmers and food processors, agreed on a lot of what the reaction to the budget was. I think that there is kind of a common sentiment, a common cause. One of the things, Shaun, that I'm continued to kind of wait and see about is, when do we see more of a push from the agriculture minister on some of these issues? Again, is he going to try and show some leadership? Are we going to see kind of a strategic emphasis in what the reductions mean and how they're rolled out? I think we have to wait and see what that looks like. Or is it going to continue to be kind of steady as she goes? We're going to kind of cut the easy stuff. Again, I will say that of all of the things I would have cut at Ag Canada, I'm not sure Living Labs would have been kind of top of my list or the top 5 of my list. We have an extension issue in this country. That was a bit of an effort to try and fix that. But it's probably a relatively easy thing in the grand scheme of things for the government to cut at the end of the day. I hope that as we find out more, we find out that there's more of a vision behind some of that vision that people have been asking about earlier.
So from your experience, for those of us that are outside the Ottawa bubble, what happens now? So they pass the budget. That's the next step, of course. Assuming it passes, then typically would the minister and the staff be reaching out to industry, and is there like a stakeholder piece of this, or is this more like, listen, here's some of the details, here's what we're doing?
No, I think if you look at past experience, when we rolled out budget cuts in 2012, it was because there's that kind of direct workforce engagement. Governments typically say, here's the decision that we've made, here's this process that we're undertaking. Once the decision has been made, often there's very little room for engagement beyond about that specific cut that's there. Again, we've heard the leaders in the public service say, once we know that the budget's going to pass, we will start to communicate that. We're going to communicate quickly and transparently. So we may find out in the next couple of weeks a great deal more information than what we have today. I don't expect that there will be much consultation around that, Shaun, but hopefully there will be consultation and engagement around what comes next. Once these cuts have been made, what does it look like? What's the role government plays, and how do we move forward? But I expect that we will all find out that the cuts are the cuts and they're being implemented.
It's a pivotal moment for Canada. It's a fork in the road, however you want to phrase that. It is a fascinating time, not only for the country, but obviously what agriculture is going to look like when it grows up, as the saying goes. So, Tyler, I'll pass it off to you to close out the webinar.
Well, I would just say thank you to you, Shaun, and maybe I should say when we're talking about government spending, CAPI does exist because we benefit from government spending. So I'll declare our conflict. We have a vested interest in which programs are cut and reduced, but we always try and approach these things from a very independent, unbiased perspective. But we'll acknowledge that. I appreciate the ongoing support that everyone shows in this topic. Budgets are really important. We do think that this is going to continue on, and so stay tuned for more information and more analysis. And Shaun, I think we provided some additional analysis to Real Agriculture through a policy brief that your team will share in the days ahead. So go on over to realagriculture.com where you can get access to that and get more feedback around what these changes may mean for the sector.
Yeah, and we'll continue this discussion on this Friday's episode of Real Ag Radio, the podcast, where we got Tyler will be with us for the issues panel to talk about more about this and other stuff as well. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Please keep participating in these webinars and great Q&A throughout. Really appreciate all the questions and the participation interaction. It's all just creates an environment to move forward and to get a whole bunch of different perspectives. So really appreciate it. Until next time, thanks a lot, everybody. Cheers.